Oh,
Let's go. Kick us off. What do you want to start with?
so I really was interested in, because the other day you were talking about something in relation to, like, endurance, right? I think you were talking about box jumps or something like that. And I was like,
Fun.
Josh, let's talk about discomfort.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, yeah, I was just interested in it because there's been a couple of times that I've seen you, like, talk about things where I'm like, are you like, what is your relationship to discomfort and training and coaching, given that you're pushing people? And also, yeah, I don't know. Also, you've got some wild stuff. You've got a tattoo that says "suffer," and I've been curious about that. And also, totally okay with the, like, like, f off, like, lady in the grocery store, like, looking at my tattoo stuff, where they're like, what's the meaning behind that one?
Yeah.
It's a ship, it's fine, but, like, I don't know, I was just curious, so I wanted to, but I knew we were never going to get around to that in a half-hour training check-in, so I figured that
Yeah.
I would see if I could chat with you about
Yeah.
that, and about, because I was curious like a cat, you know
100%. Yeah. So, just for context, that initial comment you made about the box jump, that was something that for people that are listening to this, there are some people that follow this guy. His name's Dr. Andy Galpin. He put a fucking Twitter post out that's basically like essentially what it meant is box jumps, there's a certain way to train them for power, and you can't just do a box jump and expect a bunch of things to happen. There needs to be some specifics around velocity training and power training and rest intervals and blah blah. And I sort of took that and extrapolated it a little bit
hmm
and talked about there being specifics. Whatever your goal is, it's not like the exercise selection that is the only factor. That's of course a important thing, like you would know, Cormac, and what we're doing, like, there's lots of different exercises you're doing, but it's also like, what is the goal? Okay, well, then there's specific rep ranges that are going to help that more, and there's specific rate of perceived exertion would be a part of that as well. You have to train a certain intensity as well. Can't
hmm
only train crazy hard or only train where you don't feel things. And then there needs to be appropriate rest intervals. So I think just with that specific thing, people do get hung up, I think, on like, what's the best exercise for this? And it's like, great, good question. How does everything else look in your life? And that's sometimes the shitty thing about giving advice when you're a coach and you look at, a larger picture.
hmm
You've always been good at asking questions because you assume that there's going to be a bigger answer than just like, yep, here it is. So
we fixed it.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's awesome. In terms of the tattoo, yeah, I remember you asked me about this before, and I don't think I wanted to share about it at the time. Um, I think anytime you have something on your fucking chest in writing, it's going to get a lot. It's pretty bold, right? It's
It
it's a little
is, and
bit.
it's a big font on yours. I have a big chest piece myself, right? Like,
Yeah,
so, like, I understand, but that's quite a piece.
yeah, yeah. It's pretty bold, right? And it's a little bit like a singular face tattoo. People are going to notice that, and people want to talk about it too. It's bold enough where it draws attention, and that's not. I don't know that that's what I got it for, but the meaning behind it is quite simple. We all have a different, or we all have our own association with what the word suffer means.
Yeah.
For me, it is certainly a reminder of a time in my life where I chose to really get personally gritty. I wanted to discover some of the corners of myself, and that meant pushing some limits and trying to push limits and discovering how sort of mentally tough I could get without complaining about things.
Hmm.
And the word suffer was like it was a good inspiration. It was like a self. I've talked about this recently, be your best, be the best version of a personal trainer that you can be to yourself.
Mm.
And for that, like the word suffer was that for me. There was no self-hate with that. There was no like, you piece of shit, do more. It was like, holy fuck, yeah, you can do this. Like that kind of mentality of like, see, like we're in this together. It's like you create another, almost like you create another version of yourself that you can access and have
Yeah.
like, internal dialogue with.
Yeah. I think that's incredible. Like, um, there, when one of the things that I think is cool about the word suffer is that, um, this idea of like, there's this other sense to it, which you can see in like biblical passages. Like there's one where it's like, like suffer, like when Jesus is like, just don't work, don't make people go away. He's like, well, suffer them to stay with me, or like suffer, like it means that like it means to like to be with and to endure and to
Mm.
like, so there's this kind of thing of like enduring and like bearing, more so than like we often think about like suffering as being like specifically related to pain um or like things like that, whereas like there's like in an older sense of the word, it has to do with endurance and bearing with, which is interesting.
That's really interesting because I'm not very familiar or affiliated with Christianity, and that definition sounds a lot more like how I had it in my mind than what's maybe a little bit more of a modern approach to exactly what you said.
Yeah, and I only bring
Grief,
up that
loss,
example
sadness.
because like there's like that, it's one of the few examples that I can think of like where that word is used in that kind of older sense. But yeah, um but yeah,
Cool.
it's neat that it's truer to that older sense for you. That's cool.
Yeah. 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 So that's why I got that. And, I do get a lot of people that ask me, the people that ask me about it, aside from you, because you're humble and you're just curious. Most of the time, the people that ask me automatically have some judgment around it. And the more I've realized that, I feel the judgment, the more I'm like, that's work that I need to do on myself.
Right.
So that's been interesting as well.
That's a hardworking tattoo in a lot of ways, right? To also then have it, it's a tattoo that's also in dialogue with the world around it, such that you're also continuing to reflect and have it teach you things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's not a lot of other examples of that I have. Like, people don't comment on my body, or people don't comment on anything else about me or how I look. It's just that.
Right.
So it is interesting that in a lot of ways, I mean, it's not surprising, but it is interesting that people also feel that they can, be judgmental towards me in that way.
Mm, mm.
Like I don't believe that I've ever done that and approach someone about it, right? Like it's one thing to have your judgments about someone and to try to work on that in yourself, but to
Mm-hmm.
have a judgment and then to ask someone like, why did you get that?
Right.
What does that mean? Like that kind of stuff where it's like, what? It's not even about what you want to hear. It's at that point, it's how I'm interpreting my own security with how I feel about it, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It becomes about, the choices that another person wouldn't make, which is great because they
Yeah.
didn't,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. You nailed it. Yeah. Yeah. You totally nailed it. There is a funny story about this too, that there seem to be a couple communities that really just sort of got it.
Mm.
And because for the first like few months, I didn't even feel comfortable taking my shirt off in places where you generally would be more inclined to take your shirt off, like hot yoga, for instance. You go into a
Yeah,
hot yoga
certainly.
class, at least most men are not wearing shirts.
Yeah, it's hot and it's yoga.
Exactly. So for a while, like for a couple months, I wore a shirt where I wouldn't normally. So I was actually pretty conscious about it, even though I was like on my own doing this type of training and doing, a lot of intense stuff. But it's interesting because the people that are in like the yoga community seem to understand when they read it. They're like, oh, I get it, like without asking.
Yeah.
And I think the reason behind that is like in life is suffering, and that's a common like Buddha principle or something like that. And I know yoga is
Yeah,
big
well,
out of India.
I think that tie-in, because when I sent you the question, it's like, okay, so what is this? What is your relationship to discomfort or to pain, or even to endurance, right? Like, I think people who are coming from a more, especially in yoga, right? I don't practice yoga, but the people who I know who practice yoga in a serious way, there's this kind of like deep spiritual component that has this, and like has this very physical practice, which is not comfortable, right? Like
Right.
like there's a lot of pushing, there's a lot of being with this kind of um physical discomfort, and like accepting it and being with it and things like that. It doesn't surprise me that a pack of hot yogis got what you were getting after,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And then the other community that got it was the endurance community. As you're stating, you're tying these things in together perfectly. Um, but I remember doing, really long runs, races, and not wearing a shirt. Hot day, you're running for 6 hours. It's not strange. And there was a brand. I even had a friend that had a shirt. It said "Suffer" on the chest of the shirt, and there's a
Mm,
picture of me standing beside them, and people are just laughing because they're like, I have the shirt essentially printed on me, and they're wearing a
yeah,
shirt version of it. It's pretty funny.
yeah.
But that's another obviously community where people get it. Like people are used to, enduring or suffering or whatever the word is. It's synonymous.
Yeah, it is. It is. No, like, and certainly, at least in one sense of the word, it is. I think that the interesting thing about suffering and the way that people take it is that I think that, especially because we use the word suffering in such a heavy way, we're like, oh, to suffer, like it's like pain plus duration, right? Which, to be fair, I think is reasonable to talk about in the context of training or coaching or like pushing through. But it's pain plus duration. And like, um, it's weird because, like, of course that's a major factor of life, both physically, emotionally, spiritually. Like, everybody has episodes or periods or even seasons where they're experiencing um, pain plus duration, right? So it's interesting to me, like it doesn't surprise me that people are like sort of bounce against that, the tattoo, because I think that, then at that point they're also bouncing against their own response to their own experiences of suffering, their own experiences of fleeing it rather than running towards it, uh, or even being with it in a way that feels neutral, like not running towards or away from. You know what I mean? Like, people
Mhm.
have a lot of feelings about suffering because it's pain plus duration, right?
Yeah. I love how you're saying this. Yeah. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So tie it in for me, Josh. Like, tie it in for me. Like in the context of, so for you, like you were like leaning into this experience of grit, and being like, okay, like, and even I think, you're talking about this kind of endurance stuff or like inner fortitude or things like that. Like, so how does that tie in with your practice now?
Yeah. So truthfully, I got a little bit disconnected with it when we had Sorrel,
Right.
when we had our son, right? Our two, he's over two now. Uh,
Beautiful
like,
little guy.
he's great. Yeah, he's very beautiful. So yeah, truthfully, there was a little bit of a disconnect, and which is part of it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just, being, there's, if anything, there's maybe even more suffering being a parent and, ending relationship and all, yeah,
Yeah,
pregnancy
well, you
releases
don't
and
sleep. You've
abortion.
got you've got a whole new, like, you're exploding into like this role
Yeah.
of like love and
Yeah.
caretaking that's
Well,
permanent.
this is the interesting part about it too, is like, you know, you and I have been involved in this training aspect for some time. I've been involved in it
Yes.
for a long time, but you've been in it for a while. And it's like I feel like, I don't want to be too generic, but I think we idolize people that can do things, like physically bear things. At least I do. And
Certainly.
I
Yeah.
look at fucking parents and I'm like, well, there's the woman, like look around and everyone knows 700 women that have given birth.
Yeah, like everybody's
Sometimes.
like moms. It's like, and then we're like, mom jeans, those are cute. It's
Yeah.
like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Well, I'm like the physical training is not even, it's not, it's a vehicle, I guess. I'm sort of constructing this out loud as you're asking me this. It's a vehicle, and there's lots of hard shit about training for sure. And I mean, in no way have I reached an end point, because you can always do things longer. You can always, change the variables to make it more challenging and more intense and blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, parents probably have the hardest jobs out of anyone. Now that I am a parent, I'm starting to, with only 2 years of experience, I'm starting to feel a lot of the difficulty and the suffering, because it's not just physical, there's a lot of emotional stuff, obviously.
Yeah.
And I'm like, people are so much tougher than they think they are, in a good, resilient kind of way. Like and I know you have a lot of experience. If I turn the tables and was asking you these questions, I bet I would be shocked to hear some of the stuff that you have been through, and like the shit that makes you fucking be able to stand up tall. Like that's the shit that training and exercise is like a vehicle to be able to reinforce, I think, what we're truly capable of. And for me, like, I want to be a very capable person, and I want to be resilient. And I don't necessarily think I'm, was born this fucking warrior person. So,
no, you were born a baby.
I was born a baby. Yeah.
You were born an incredible, you were born into this world in desperate need of the care of others. That's how we come in, right?
Couldn't be more vulnerable. Yeah, totally. So I'm like, I know there's a draw to me to being, having more capacity, and to being brave, and to being courageous. Especially in a world where that doesn't mean war for me. Like, that's not the option. I'm gonna pursue bravery.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, what are the examples then? It's like, well, we can parent, we can train, we can get into fucking cold water, we can do shit in snow. Like, we can do normal everyday stuff that's uncomfortable to me and to anyone else. We can just do it without complaining about it. And there's a great, I don't know if it's a proverb, but there's a great line. It may be a proverb. I read this in a book. I can't recall the book. It was this mountaineer, which, again, you want to talk about toughness. It's like, all right, let's talk about those friggin' people.
Yeah.
Right?
Let's talk about them. They got friggin', they're like digits, their fingers, climbers, but then like mountaineers they're in the sky. That's not where people, like, very few people get to the top of mountains and are like, you know what? Yeah, awesome. This is hospitable to human life.
Yeah, totally, right? It's next level. And the line was just because my hands are cold doesn't mean I have to say they are. And it was like,
that's heavy. Yeah.
So like, that's the kind of shit where I'm like, this is the stuff I think about. And I'm like, we have to blow it up into society, obviously, because I'm not just talking about myself, but it starts with me. It's like, I don't want to be one of those people that feels like I can't do stuff because it's a little uncomfortable, whatever the example is. Picking shit up, or doing some fucking yard work, or carrying your kid, or doing the workout, or going outside because it's cold, or going in the water, or whatever. Like, I just think these are all pretty normal things like that almost everyone can do. And to be able to train to do these things, I think it's like, number one, or maybe next point, a lot of the reason I do these things is not for me at all.
Right.
I've been toying with this idea, and I believe it now. And that's, I think, and I'm really curious to hear your opinion on this, like your personal opinion, and maybe how religion maybe ties into this, because you're well studied within religion as well.
Yeah.
And that is like, by being more selfish, it's really a reflection of selflessness, or it leads to selflessness, because the more capable I am, the more I show people just through my actions that I'm a more capable person, that I'm, resilient or brave, or that I can do things, that I can take care of myself. I'm really helping other people in a lot of ways. Number one, they're going to see me doing those things. So that may be a bit of a boost for them. Number
Mhm.
two, they may notice like, holy shit, he can do that. Maybe I can too. Like
Mm,
maybe it's like leading by example, essentially,
mm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, no, I see that. And I think that, like, especially in the kind of work that you're doing, that makes a lot of sense. I think because, and I mean, this is an interesting thing about trainers and coaches and things like that, is that to some extent you have to do
Yeah.
that because because it becomes part of not just your brand and the kind of like sort of like callous sense of that, but like people are assuming that you have some knowledge, that they want what you have. They're like, what is this guy doing? Why is he doing it? Can I do it? He's a guy. He was just a guy.
Yeah, we're guys. Can we both do it? Like,
He's just there. He's walking on the beach, like evidently he breathes air like us mere mortals, but it's friggin' ripped. Like, what's going on? Like, so like
yeah.
people are like, some of that is that I think is part of your line of work, is that your work, and to some extent your livelihood, depends on people um having a sense not only of inspiration but like also of possibility through your example, right? Like possibility for
Mm,
their own selves. um and like not that and like the nice thing is, like, I know that you're not walking around being like, I would like trying to make a legion of sort of disparate Joshes around. Like, it's not like you're trying to make a million Joshes. You're
mm.
you're like, it's kind of like whatever it is that is somebody else's best self, which I think you alluded to earlier, right?
Yeah.
uh, and like that makes sense to me, what you're talking about. um like and I think that there's a lot to be said about, when you're talking about that capacity. um like, I think for me, like, one of the reasons why it's like, why would you want to like push what you think you're capable of, or why would you not want to be limited in those things? And I think there's a couple of reasons. Like, you're talking about helping people out by having them believe more for themselves through your example. The other thing is, like, people also know that you're capable. Like, you've got you've got broad shoulders, like in every kind of sense of that, right?
Mm.
um like, for me, I think one of the things that when we first started working together that I talked about with you is like, I want to be the guy who people call when they need to move something heavy.
Yeah.
Like, and it's funny, like, frig, just like clarion call. Today, my buddy gave me a call and was like, "Can you move our couch up some stairs tomorrow?" And I was like, "Yeah." But like, that's part, like, there's like, it's a funny thing, right? It's like, because like, you know that doesn't happen by nothing. It's like they know I lift heavy stuff recreationally, and they're like,
Mm.
you're the heavy stuff lifting guy now.
Yeah.
you know
Totally.
so yeah.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
And I think like there's so many points to this, but being capable also, it's in some ways, and it's not strictly physical or strictly
No,
broad
certainly not.
shoulders, but capacity also equates to more or reliability. And
Sure.
you know,
Oh, frig, and I'm working on that. Like, I think that's a huge part. It's a huge part of all of it, right?
yeah.
Like, one of the things that I think about, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this stuff, is like this idea of steadfastness. I keep circling around this idea of being steadfast.
Mm,
Um, Another old word. Um, but like, that's something that I want for myself, but it's not something that comes easily to me, because it's way easier to be flaky.
totally.
Um, so much easier. Like, maybe not in the long term. In the long term, actually, like, there's a lot of times it just bites me later on, and I'm like, I hate that consequence.
Yeah.
Gross.
Yeah.
But like the daily practice of being steadfast is really quite uncomfortable a lot of the time. It involves doing things that I don't actually really want to do,
Mm.
in kind of like daily way or a minutia way.
What do you
You know?
mean? Okay, so like I'm familiar with steadfast, but in the context of you saying that, operating in a steadfast manner is uncomfortable, what does that mean to you?
I think that to some extent it's what you mentioned earlier really resonated with me, where you're like, I want to be the kind of guy who's like, like pick up the things that are on the ground, like carry my kid, like, like do these things that are, it's like, it's not it's easier to walk around not carrying heavy stuff, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's nicer, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But so like when I say steadfastness, I think that for me, like what that's about is not only it's like doing things like being reliable. You know, if I say I'm going to be there, I'm going to be there. Being like, for me, like one thing that's a huge struggle is like timeliness or doing what I say I'm going to do. Like, because I have like about 5 bright ideas per second, and I'm like, I could do this other thing, you know, like, you know, like making a plan and sticking to it is not my forte, because I'm like, there's so many plans. Why would I hold myself to what past Cormac thought?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and it's like, well, there's a reason, which is that there's value in being steadfast and being like somebody who like people can rely on, not only like my presence, but also my character, consistency in, you know, like if I aspire to be a person who's honest, who's helpful, who's generous, who's like who's kind or gentle, even any of those things, like then to actually like be those things in action, and not, and like it's like kind of what you're saying, you know, or like not talking about it, but just being about it.
Yeah.
But the weird thing is, and I think this is the part that like, you know, that is where the rabbit hole gets deeper, is that it keeps going backwards and backwards and backwards. Like if I want to be kind, I have to fucking sleep, Josh.
Yeah.
Like I need, like, you know what I think? Like, it's funny how like things that feel lofty, like the ability to be kind, you know, often do things like relate to things like eating regular meals.
Yeah.
And so when I say steadfastness, it's funny because often what I'm looking for is these kind of like sort of airy fairy lofty things. Like, you know, I would like to be a person who's worthy of respect, or that somebody who can be relied upon.
Mhm.
And so often what it ends up going back to is these like friggin' like daily minutia, this quotidian shit, like of like, well, I got up and I brushed my teeth
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I ate a vitamin and a nutrient for
Yeah.
breakfast, you
Yeah.
know, like, and like that's the hard part. It's like that's where it starts, is in these places that don't feel like they matter, or feel like maybe doing something easier won't make an impact, and then it does. So yeah,
100%. Yeah. That's a great tie-in. Yeah.
yeah, and like that's the part I think that like I'm, you know, kind of thinking through and like wrestling with, is that I'm like, oh, all of these are choices, and they are actually all connected to each other in this kind of inextricable way that not only affects me, but actually affects other people around me who are
That,
in relationship with me, you
that's
know.
it. Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. What we do affects other people. I think and that's a hard thing. And I'm certainly not always aware of it. Like
Yeah,
that's a,
no.
probably no one is always aware of it, but I think the more we can be mindful that, you know, what we do actually does affect a lot of people, and not necessarily even just the people that see us doing that thing, the people that feel us doing that thing or hear about us doing that thing. And it's, yeah, we're talking like Jordan Peterson has, I'm not sure if you're a fan of his or not, but this is one sort of principle he talks about. And this is essentially what I'm talking about too, or what you're saying, with what we do matters. And same thing as what we say matters. But it's like most people have 1,000 relationships in, is it 1,000? Most people come into contact with 1,000 people. No, maybe it's 1,000,000. What's the number?
A
1,000.
lot.
I think he says 1,000. So,
Sure.
so essentially he says, he's like, let's do the math here. So you're one step away from 1,000,000 people. Then if 1,000 people each see 1,000 people, that's 1,000,000. So in one step, we're all of a sudden at 1,000,000 people.
Yeah,
That's a fuckload of impact.
it is.
So
Yeah.
if we can just, you know, do some stuff that challenges us a little bit, like we'll wrap up here, but if we can find some ways that challenge us so that we can potentially be humbled, or potentially increase our, you know, our kind of like self-esteem and our self-confidence, we're like sort of like bordering on, we're starting to sort of hit up against some of the edges of where we're kind of moving, whether it's like weight training or fucking, I don't know, cold water seems to be a really good example, because it's Can you get in there? How do you feel? Can you stay in there? And the next day is a different day altogether. So it's
Right.
like you're bumping into walls. Like, how am I breathing? Am I even noticing my breathing? What is going on through my head? Can I get myself regrounded in this cold water, whatever the situation is?
Right.
That's just an example. We don't all need to do it. Yeah, I think it's just identifying. So to your kind of initial question, like talking about that discomfort, maybe just finding some things that you can implement with that are fairly accessible to implement,
Mm.
and to practice, like chip away at them. Literally, I guess this is a bit of a nice analogy, but chip away at
Sure.
that, because it's going to be pretty hard. It would be really hard for me to start out training and then to do a fucking 24-hour run in a shipping container if I hadn't done any of the lead up to that. Or
No, in fact, it would be impossible, right? Like it's
it'd
like,
be pretty hard. I'd have to be threatened. I'd have to be severely threatened to be able to do that, I think.
yeah, yeah. And I think that, so like microdosing hell. Um, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, you're dosing the discomfort. That's what I call it.
Yeah,
All it is,
yeah,
you're making a choice to be like, this is gonna be a little uncomfortable, and for a probably a tangible, like a specific amount of time. You're not just
yeah,
gonna go in the cold water and be like, well, I don't know, I could end up going in for 4 hours. It's like you're gonna go in for 2 to 5 minutes. Like, you're gonna have a goal. You're going to the gym. You're like, I'm gonna work out for about an hour. I'm gonna be doing this many sets. Like, it
mhm,
doesn't just go on for eternity. Like, you have a fixed finishing point with a lot of
yeah,
what we do with training. So there's some certainty in that too. I think it's when there's
yeah,
uncertainty, that's where it gets fucking really hellish.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And
and
that's
I think that
life.
like
And that's life.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, I think that one of the things that kind of stuck out to me that made me kind of interested in asking you in the first place was this idea around skill building around discomfort, right?
Mhm.
And about how, to some extent, like endurance around discomfort is like a set of skills that can be improved upon, and like you can lean into that learning, even though it's uncomfortable, and that's part of it.
I think we
Um,
should do a part two of this. This felt great. I feel like that.
yeah.
Yeah, you should do a podcast. That was awesome.